Now, there's a closely related point here. Now, as you say, one thing that can come out of union organization and organizing the proletariat is not strictly economic. What we can do is use that as a launching pad toward having members of the proletariat, perhaps people who have put some time in union organization, run for political office. Most of the capitalist systems also have various kinds of democratic and republican institutions. They've extended the franchise to huge numbers of people. So perhaps the road is not simply through bargaining in the capitalist marketplace, but through politics. So why don't we use democracy as our tool of advancing the interests of the proletariat? After all, the proletariat, again, are the huger number, right, by far. And so if they're in a position to vote and democracy institutionalize the policy of majority rule, in most voting districts, the proletariat are going to be the majority, so they should be able to elect representatives who are sympathetic to their economic interests, who can then pass legislation that is favorable to the proletariat, or perhaps take away various kinds of legislation that have been put in place that are favorable to the bourgeoisie. Well, again, the Marxists will say that's fine, and there can be some value to all of this, but again, they don't think that this is going to be very effectual in the long run. On the one hand, they're going to argue that in a democratic system, elections are very expensive to run, and so it's still the case that the members of the bourgeoisie have greater amounts of wealth at their disposal, and so they're in many cases going to be able rather to outspend any given proletariat, or member of the proletariat who runs. Of course, the counter-argument to that is to say, well, then unions, of course, are collecting membership dues from the proletariat, so collectively they should have a great deal of economic muscle to be able to put behind a given election, and so they should be able to get some members elected to Parliament or elected to Congress, right, and so forth. And then that very well might be true, but it's going to be a certain amount of time. It might be a generation, right, or 2 generations, the Marxists will point out, until there's a critical mass of people who get elected to Parliament or to Congress, right, in the United States. So again, it's a very slow process. It's not a process that's going to guarantee success. There's also a problem that any number of members of the proletariat who then do get elected to political office, they might be co-opted by the system. They like all the perks of being in Parliament, right, and so on. And so they cut all sorts of deals. You know, democracy is very messy, and in many cases it's deals cut under the table or in various kinds of back rooms. There's no guarantee that the elected representatives from the unions or directly from the proletariat are going to remain true to their class comrades. It's also the case that if you look at the democratic or republican structures in most of the capitalist countries, there are built-in checks against democracy. So suppose we do after a generation or 2 succeed in getting a majority of representatives in, say, Parliament to be sympathetic to the interests of the proletariat. They then start passing legislation that is sympathetic to the proletariat. Well, that legislation gets through Parliament, right, or gets through Congress, but then if you take the American context, then it has to go to the Senate. And then who is in control of the Senate? Well, there are various kinds of constitutional restrictions on who can be a member, right, of the Senate. And the argument then is going to be most of the people who are senators are representatives of the bourgeoisie. And they might allow a few pieces of legislation to get through, but anything that's actually genuinely threatening to the capitalist status quo is simply going to be vetoed by the Senate. Or then if we say, well, then we just do the same thing with respect to the Senate, it can then be vetoed by the president, right? And then, of course, if it gets passed and it gets put into law, there's no necessity that the executive branch of government is actually going to act on the basis of the law. It can be shelved. And then there's the Supreme Court, and there can be various legal challenges, right, to the law and so forth. So the argument then is that from the Marxist perspective, that route is, there's no guarantees of success. In fact, there's a chance that the whole system is going to be stretched out for such a long period of time that you're just going to end up with a muddled mixed economy. Capitalism will be forced to make certain sorts of compromises, but the underlying nature of the system is not going to change. Now, the Marxists will also argue that aside from trying to solve the problem economically through this and trying to solve the problem politically through this, The class conflict also plays out ideologically, and there's another major weapon that the capitalists have at their disposal that works to the advantage of the bourgeoisie and against the proletariat, and that weapon is religion. That religion, from the Marxist perspective, is not simply a false set of beliefs. The Marxists are materialists, so they're on principle atheist. Religion, though, is a social institution, that's reflecting a certain set of underlying economic interests. And what we should find then in the capitalist economies is that religion is serving to rationalize, justify, and empower underlying economic capital interests. So religion is a tool that the capitalists will use in order to forestall any evolution toward socialism, and it's certainly something that they will use to prop up the capitalist institutions and even cause members of the proletariat to think that their better interests actually lie with capitalism rather than an evolving socialism. All right, so what does all of that mean as a set of assertions there? What is the nature of religion in capitalist society, and how does it serve as a cover or as a rationalization or as a prop that justifies a capitalist social structure?